It was supposed to be a day of love, Valentine's Day, a time for romance, for affection, for moments that become cherished memories. But in a quiet town in rural Georgia, that day took a horrifying turn. A woman's desperate voice broke through the still night. "Oh my God, please, I need help right now." She wasn't calling for love. She was calling for help. Her husband was dead, shot, left bleeding in the darkness. This is the story of Richard Sheik, a devoted husband and father whose Valentine's Day ended in tragedy, and the twisted web of secrets, betrayal, and murder for hire that followed. In the next 30 minutes, we'll take you through every shocking detail of this case, from the eerie crime scene to the cold-blooded masterminds who thought they could get away with murder. Stay with us as we unravel the truth behind one of the most chilling murder plots to ever unfold in Georgia. If you love true crime stories that expose hidden betrayals and unravel the minds of killers, make sure to subscribe to True Crime Intel and hit the notification bell, because what you're about to hear is the dark side of love. Rural Georgia is the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where life moves a little slower, and where the biggest news on any given day might be a high school football game or a new diner opening in town. It's the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked, where families have lived for generations, and where crime, especially violent crime, feels like something that happens somewhere else. It was in this quiet setting that Richard and Stacy Sheik built their lives. Richard was the kind of man who left an impression on everyone he met. At 46, he was a stay-at-home dad who devoted his life to raising Stacy's two sons from a previous marriage. People described him as outgoing, friendly, and always willing to lend a helping hand. He wasn't just a stepfather. He was a real father to those boys. He coached their teams, helped them with their schoolwork, and made sure they had everything they needed. He was the type of man who put family first. When he married Stacy, he didn't just take on the role of husband. He became the foundation of their home. He made dinner, packed lunches, and drove the kids to school. Friends and family saw him as the kind of person who would do anything for the people he loved. Stacy, on the other hand, was the opposite. She was ambitious, hardworking, and constantly juggling responsibilities as the head administrator of a large medical and surgical practice. While Richard stayed home to take care of the kids, Stacy was the one bringing in the paycheck. She had built a successful career, one that demanded long hours and constant attention. She was respected at work, seen as someone who had it all together. She made big decisions, managed people, and controlled the details of her professional life with precision. But behind that image, there was something else, something no one saw. For years, the couple seemed happy. Their life wasn't perfect, but from the outside, it looked solid. Friends and family saw them as a couple who had figured things out. Richard took care of the home, and Stacy took care of everything else. People believed they had a partnership that worked, a marriage that balanced the responsibilities of love, work, and family. But things were about to change. On the night of February 14th, Richard had one simple plan: spend Valentine's Day with Stacy and her elderly grandparents. A holiday meal together, a small celebration. Richard had spent the entire day making sure everything was perfect. He prepared dinner, a meal that Stacy's grandparents, who required round-the-clock medical care, could enjoy. It was a quiet, thoughtful way to mark the occasion. Not flashy, not over the top, just a moment to be together. Then, later that night, they would exchange gifts in a nearby park, a private moment just for the two of them. It was Stacy's idea. She told Richard to go ahead and meet her there. The nurse who was supposed to relieve her had arrived late, so she needed a little extra time. Richard didn't think twice. He trusted Stacy completely. So he got in his truck, drove to the park, and waited. The park wasn't the kind of place most people would choose for a Valentine's Day date. It was secluded, with no pavement, no lights, and very little foot traffic at night. A quiet, empty space surrounded by trees. Richard sat in his truck, maybe scrolling through his phone, maybe listening to the radio. He had no idea that someone else was already there. He had no idea that he was being watched. It was a plan that should have ended with smiles, laughter, and maybe a kiss under the moonlight. Instead, it ended in blood. 30 minutes passed. Stacy pulled up to the park, expecting to find Richard waiting for her, eager to exchange gifts. She had told him to meet her there, promising she'd arrive as soon as the nurse relieved her at her grandparents' home. But something felt wrong the moment she drove in. The park was silent, too silent. Richard's truck was still running, its engine humming softly in the cold night air. The headlights were on, casting long, eerie shadows across the uneven ground. The driver's side door was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. And then she saw it, a figure on the ground. Her stomach dropped. She stepped closer, her heart pounding, her breath catching in her throat. It was Richard. He wasn't moving. His body lay sprawled on the dirt, his limbs awkwardly positioned. A dark pool of blood spread beneath him, soaking into the earth. She stood frozen for a moment, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. Then came the panic. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking so hard she could barely press the buttons. "Oh my God! Please, I need help right now!" Her voice was high-pitched, frantic. She could barely get the words out. Within minutes, the first patrol car arrived. The red and blue lights flashed across the empty park, painting the trees in bursts of color. Two officers stepped out, their hands resting on their holsters. They moved cautiously toward the scene, their breath visible in the cool night air. They had seen crime scenes before, but something about this one felt different. They approached Richard's body carefully, their flashlights scanning the area. No movement. No sound except the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. Richard was dead. That much was obvious. One of the officers knelt beside him, checking for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. The other took in the scene, assessing the details, noting what was there and what wasn't. The first thing that stood out? Nothing was missing. Richard's wallet was still in his pocket. His wedding ring was still on his finger. His expensive truck, worth over $40,000, hadn't been touched. It was clear this wasn't a robbery. Whoever had done this came with one purpose: to kill. The brutality of the attack was shocking. Richard had been shot multiple times, one bullet to the chest, two to the face. This wasn't just a killing, it was an execution. Someone wanted to make sure Richard Sheik was dead. Detectives arrived soon after, stepping into a crime scene that gave them more questions than answers. They scanned the ground for footprints, for shell casings, for any sign of the person who had been here before them. But the scene was eerily clean. No footprints, no dropped weapon, no blood trails leading away. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air, but then something caught their attention. In the wet soil just beyond where Richard's truck was parked were fresh tire tracks. They didn't match Richard's truck, and they didn't match Stacy's car. That meant only one thing. Someone else had been here. Someone who had arrived before Richard, waited, and then left after he was already dead. The officers exchanged a look. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. A crime of passion is usually messy, spur of the moment, rushed, with plenty of evidence left behind. But this was something different. Someone had planned this. Someone had wanted Richard Sheik dead. And for now, they had gotten away with it. The investigation began immediately. Detectives knew that in a murder case like this, the first 48 hours were critical. The longer it took to identify a suspect, the harder it would be to solve the crime. The first step was understanding Richard Sheik. Who was he? Did he have enemies? Was there anyone in his life who would want him dead? Everything about Richard's past suggested the answer was no. He wasn't involved in crime. He had no known disputes, no history of violence. He was, by all accounts, a devoted husband and stepfather, a man who put his family first. He had no financial troubles, no criminal record, no history of drug use or gambling. Detectives interviewed friends and family, looking for any hint of a conflict that could have led to his murder. Everyone said the same thing. Richard was a good man. He had no enemies. But as the investigation continued, something didn't sit right. Random killings were rare. This wasn't a robbery. The attack was brutal. 2 bullets to the face, 1 to the chest. That wasn't the work of a panicked thief. That was personal. That was deliberate. It suggested one thing. Someone wanted Richard dead, and they wanted to make sure of it. As detectives examined the crime scene, they focused on the only real clue they had, the tire tracks. They needed to find out who had been in the park that night. They took photographs, measured the impressions in the soil, and began the process of identifying the exact make and model of the tires. It was a long shot, but sometimes the smallest details broke a case wide open. At the same time, they needed to rule out the most obvious suspect, Richard's wife, Stacy. They asked her to come in for questioning. She was still visibly shaken, her hands trembling, as she sat across from the detectives. They started with the basics. Tell us about your husband. Did he have any problems with anyone? Did he ever mention feeling threatened? Stacy shook her head. No. Everyone loved Richard. He was the nicest person you could ever meet. Did he seem nervous before going to the park? Did he mention seeing anything suspicious? Again, she said no. The detectives kept pressing. You were supposed to meet him there. Why did you tell him to go ahead without you? Stacy sighed. I had to wait for the nurse to relieve me. I didn't want to keep him waiting, so I told him to go ahead. I was only supposed to be a few minutes behind him. It sounded reasonable, but something was off. The detectives studied her closely. Her story made sense, but her emotions didn't quite match the situation. Most spouses in this position were distraught, devastated, unable to process what had happened. But Stacy? She was upset, yes, but there was something else beneath the surface. Something they couldn't quite put their finger on. And then before the interview was even over, she dropped a bombshell. I need to tell you something about my husband and about me. She hesitated, then looked down at the table. I was having an affair. The room went silent. The detectives exchanged glances. It wasn't what they had expected to hear. But suddenly the case had taken a whole new turn. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Stacy kept her eyes down as if she was ashamed, but the detectives weren't sure if it was guilt over the affair or something more. Finally, one of them spoke. Tell us about the affair. Stacy took a deep breath. His name is Juan Reyes. We've been seeing each other for a few years. He used to work at my clinic. That was all it took. The moment she said his name, Juan Reyes became the prime suspect. The detectives had seen it before. A secret lover, a jealous rage, a husband standing in the way. Maybe Juan had wanted Richard out of the picture. Maybe Stacy had planned to leave Richard, and Juan wanted to speed up the process. They asked her more questions. Does Juan know Richard? Yes, but not well. I never let them be around each other. Would Juan ever want to hurt Richard? She hesitated. I don't think so, but I don't know. That wasn't the answer they expected. Most people would immediately deny that their lover could be a killer. But Stacy didn't. She left the door open, just enough to raise suspicion. The detectives pressed further. Where was Juan on the night of the murder? Stacy didn't know. Or at least that's what she said. The detectives didn't waste time. Within hours, they tracked Juan down and brought him in for questioning. When he sat down, he looked nervous, but calm. They started with a direct approach. Do you know why you're here? Yeah, it's about Richard. Did you have anything to do with his murder? No, absolutely not. Where were you that night? Juan quickly gave them his alibi. He had been having dinner with his ex-wife and their kids. He said he was home in bed by 10:30 p.m., nowhere near the park where Richard was killed. But words weren't enough. The detectives needed proof. Would you be willing to take a polygraph test? Wayne nodded without hesitation. Whatever you want me to do. That wasn't the reaction of a guilty man. Still, they ran the test. The results? Inconclusive. Not a pass, not a fail, just unclear. That meant they couldn't rule him out. Not yet. But then, something unexpected happened. Juan's ex-wife backed up his alibi. She confirmed he had been at dinner, that he had come home on time, and that he had gone to bed like he said. The detectives checked security footage from the restaurant. Juan was there, just like he claimed. It was enough. Juan Reyes wasn't their guy. But if he wasn't the killer, then who was? The detectives went back to Stacy. If her lover wasn't the one who pulled the trigger, then maybe she knew more than she was letting on. And then, just when it seemed like the case had stalled, a tip came in. A tip that would change everything. The tip came from an unexpected source, an IT technician at the spine clinic where Stacy worked. He had noticed something strange about her email account in the days leading up to the murder, strange enough that he thought the police should know about it. The detectives followed up immediately. They obtained a warrant and went through thousands of emails connected to Stacy's account. Two of them stood out. Both were sent to a bank. Both involved money transfers. And both totaled exactly $10,000. The recipient? A woman named Lenny Ross, Stacy's coworker. Now, this was interesting. Why would Stacy be sending thousands of dollars to someone right before her husband was murdered? Detectives wasted no time. They tracked Lenny down and brought her in for questioning. At first, she acted like she had no idea what they were talking about. Money? What money? Then they showed her the bank records. Lenny hesitated. She shifted in her chair. Oh, that money? Yeah, Stacy sent me some money. Why? She was just helping me out. You know, for some home repairs. The detectives exchanged a look. They weren't buying it. Lenny was struggling to keep her story straight. The amounts, the timing, it was all too perfect, too calculated. But they needed more than suspicion. They needed proof. And that's when another clue surfaced, this time from Stacy's own cousin, Connie Hearn. She told detectives that Stacy had been in charge of selling their grandparents' old car, a Chevy Impala. But here's the thing, the car never got sold. Instead, it disappeared from Stacy's driveway right around the time of the murder. The detectives had a hunch. They checked records, and then they found it. The Chevy Impala, the same one that had mysteriously vanished, was now sitting at Lenny Ross's house. And it wasn't just any car. The tires on that Impala? Goodyear Integrity tires. The exact same brand that left tracks at the crime scene. The moment the detectives saw that, they knew. Lenny wasn't just some random coworker Stacy was sending money to. She was involved. But in what way? Had she helped set up the murder? Was she covering for someone? Or worse, was she the one who pulled the trigger? They needed answers. And to get them, they had to follow one more lead. A name that had been buried in Stacy's phone records. A name that would reveal the final piece of the puzzle. A name saved under one simple contact, Mr. Results. Mr. Results. The name stood out immediately. It wasn't a common contact name, and it certainly wasn't someone Stacy had ever mentioned. The detectives pulled Stacy's phone records and cross-referenced them with cell tower data from the night of the murder. And there it was. A call made from the park, the exact location where Richard was killed, around the time of the murder. The number traced back to Reginald Coleman, popularly known as Reggie, a former semi-pro boxer and Lenny Ross's boyfriend. Everything was starting to fall into place. The detectives knew this wasn't just a crime of passion. It wasn't just an affair gone wrong. This was a murder for hire. Stacy had paid Lenny Ross, and Lenny had brought in Reggie Coleman. And Reggie? He was the one who pulled the trigger. But the detectives needed to be absolutely sure. They got a search warrant for Stacy's financial records. And that's when they found the final confirmation. Right before the murder, Stacy had transferred $10,000 to Lenny Ross. That money? It was Reggie's payment for the hit. And Lenny's reward? A house. Stacy had promised her a rent-free home, a reward for helping her get away with murder. With everything in place, detectives made their move. They called it Operation Tangled Web, a coordinated multi-county effort to arrest Stacy Sheik, Lenny Ross, and Reggie Coleman at the same time. The arrest had to be perfectly timed. If one suspect found out too soon, they could tip off the others. Reggie was the first to go down. He was arrested at his home, taken into custody without incident. Next was Lenny. She was pulled over during a routine traffic stop. She had no idea what was coming. And finally, Stacy. Detectives walked into her office, the same place where she had managed people, controlled schedules, and planned her husband's murder. She barely had time to react before the cuffs were on her wrists. She was done. But the real question was, would any of them confess? Or would they try to lie their way out of it? In the interrogation rooms, three people sat under the harsh glow of overhead lights. Stacy Sheik, Lenny Ross, and Reggie Coleman. Three people, three stories, but only one truth. The detectives started with Lenny Ross. She looked nervous, shifting in her seat, her fingers tapping anxiously against the table. "Do you know why you're here?" a detective asked. Lenny shrugged. "No clue." They slid a folder across the table. Inside were bank records, emails, and cell tower data, evidence linking her to Stacy, the money transfers, and the Chevy Impala with the matching tire tracks. She stared at the papers but said nothing. "How much money did Stacy send you?" A pause. Then finally, "It was about $8,900 at first. Then another $1,100 right before it happened." "Before what happened?" Lenny swallowed hard. "I don't know nothing about no murder." But she was lying, and the detectives knew it. So they moved on to Reggie Coleman. Unlike Lenny, Reggie wasn't nervous. He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest, trying to look calm. But when they showed him the phone records, the call made from the park at the time of the murder, his expression changed. "You made a call from the scene of the crime. Who were you calling?" Reggie clenched his jaw. He said nothing. "You're a smart guy, Reggie. You know how this works. Stacy paid Lenny. Lenny paid you. You pulled the trigger. We have the money trail. We have the car. We have the tire tracks. It's over." Still, silence. But then, in another interrogation room, Stacy started talking. At first, she denied everything. "I didn't do this. I would never hurt Richard. I loved my husband." But when detectives pressed her, her story started to crack. She admitted to the affair. She admitted to sending Lenny money. And then she dropped a bombshell. "Richard was hurting my kids," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I had to protect them." The detectives froze. This was new. This was the first time she had ever mentioned anything about abuse. "Are you saying Richard was molesting your children?" Stacy nodded, tears forming in her eyes. It was a powerful moment. If true, it would change everything. But the detectives had one big problem. There was no evidence, no reports, no accusations, nothing from the children, teachers, or family members. And then, just days later, Stacy retracted her claim. She admitted she had made it up. The truth? She didn't want to be trapped anymore. She had spent years presenting the perfect image. Devoted wife, hardworking mother, respected professional. But behind closed doors, she felt like she was suffocating. Richard wasn't abusive. He wasn't cruel. But in Stacy's mind, he was in the way. She had a secret life, a secret lover, and a future she wanted. One that didn't include the husband who had dedicated himself to raising her children. Divorce wasn't an option. Maybe she feared the scandal. Maybe she feared financial complications. Or maybe she just didn't want the hassle of a long, drawn-out separation. So instead of walking away, she planned a murder for hire. With Stacy's partial confession and the overwhelming evidence against all three suspects, the case was closed. But there was still one final chapter left. The trial, the sentencing, the final consequences. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, family members, and curious onlookers filled the seats, waiting to see how justice would be served. The trial had captured national attention, not just because of the brutal nature of the crime, but because of the cold calculation behind it. The prosecution laid out the evidence in meticulous detail: the financial transactions, the affair, the Chevy Impala and its tire tracks, the call from the park, the confessions Stacy tried and failed to take back. There was no doubt about it. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a carefully orchestrated murder for hire. And the mastermind behind it all? Stacy Sheik. Her defense team tried to paint a different picture. They argued that she was a woman trapped in a difficult marriage, desperate for a way out. They even hinted at the abuse allegations she had previously made, despite the fact that she had already admitted they were false. But the jury didn't buy it. It took them just a few hours to deliver their verdict. Guilty. Stacy Sheik was convicted of malice murder and sentenced to life without parole. She would never walk free again. Lenny Ross, who had played the role of middlewoman in the scheme, stood trial as well. Despite her efforts to distance herself, the evidence against her was just as damning. She too was found guilty of murder. Her sentence? Life without parole. And finally there was Reggie Coleman, the trigger man. With no room for negotiation, he pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. His fate was sealed. Life in prison. No chance of release. The courtroom was silent as the judge handed down the final sentence. Stacy sat motionless, her face blank. There were no more lies to tell, no more stories to spin, no more escape. She had wanted Richard out of her life. Now she would spend the rest of hers behind bars. As the years passed, the case faded from the headlines, but its impact remained. In a quiet town in Georgia, people still remembered Richard Sheik, the friendly, devoted father who had just wanted to spend Valentine's Day with his wife. They still remembered how, beneath the surface of an ordinary life, a tangled web of lies, greed, and betrayal had led to murder. And they still asked the same haunting question. How could someone plot the death of the person who loved them the most? Years later, the case of Richard Sheik still lingers in the minds of those who followed it. People who knew him, his friends, his stepchildren, his neighbors, still struggle to understand how love could turn into a death sentence. Stacy Sheik had everything she needed to walk away from her marriage. A job, financial stability, a life she could have rebuilt on her own. But instead of choosing freedom, she chose murder. She paid for her husband's life as if it were nothing more than a business transaction. $10,000. That's what Richard's life was worth to her. She recruited Lenny Ross, a trusted co-worker, to help her carry out the plan. And Lenny, in turn, brought in Reggie Coleman, the man who fired the bullets that ended Richard's life. Each of them thought they could outsmart the system. Each of them thought they could walk away. But justice found them all. Now Stacy Sheik wakes up every morning behind the bars of a prison cell. No more control, no more power, no more carefully crafted lies. She will never see another Valentine's Day as a free woman. Lenny Ross will never again make a bank transfer in exchange for someone's life. And Reggie Coleman will never again walk the streets, thinking he got away with murder. But for Richard Sheik, there is no second chance. He was a man who loved his family, a man who spent his days raising two boys who weren't biologically his, but whom he loved as his own. And in return, he was executed in a cold, dark park on the very night meant to celebrate love. This case serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers. Sometimes the person who smiles at you across the dinner table, the person who shares your bed, the person you trust the most, is the one planning your death. Let us know what you think in the comments below. What drove Stacy Sheik to make the decision that changed so many lives forever? Was it greed, selfishness, or something darker? Like this video if you want more deep dive true crime investigations. And don't forget to subscribe to True Crime Intel for more cases like this. Because if there's one thing we've learned, it's that the darkest crimes often hide behind the brightest smiles. This is True Crime Intel. Thanks for watching.